So I don't know if you're like me. I grew up obsessed with Disney princesses. So much so that I even watched the Barbie versions. And let me tell you something, these movies were something special. All right, there was this one about Rapunzel, and apparently she was like a painter and she was just magical. But there was always one princess in particular that always caught my eye just because she was so different compared to the rest of them. And this was like back in the 90s, like proper, before all the new princesses, and they were constantly trying to break the mold of the man trying to save them. And this was Pocahontas. I loved the story. Like it touched me. The story was so heartwarming and wonderful how she cared about animals. Like, I really just felt like I was a part of that world. The Disney princess, or specifically the Indian princess, as she was referred to as during the time, was actually a real story that not a lot of people know about. She was the daughter of an Anglican chief named Powhatan, who promised her in marriage to the warrior Coquitlam. And I'm sorry in advance if I butcher any of the names, I'm really trying here, who was a brave warrior that she didn't love. Now, Pocahontas would rather be paddling in her canoe or wandering the forest when these European settlers arrive, and all of a sudden, there's this guy named John Smith, the most basic of the men that she could possibly have met. But she falls head over heels for this man, even though he tries to shoot her and she's like, hey, that's not really chill. The situation, to say, is tense. The settlers desperately want the gold that they're sure that the natives are concealing. And when they're discovered in a secret meeting, a tragic mistake leads both the groups to the brink of war. But only the love of Pocahontas and Smith could prevent the bloodshed between these European settlers and the First Nations. So that is totally not true. Thanks Disney for really trying there. Pocahontas's name was actually Amuet. Her secondary name was Makota, meaning a flower between two streams. And the heartbreaking story of Pocahontas was one of tragedy and violence, like so much bloodshed. It was a story of a young girl who was brutally essayed, kidnapped, and allegedly murdered by those who were meant to keep her safe. Her name was Makota. Hi, and welcome to the Decomposing Flowers podcast. In this podcast, we delve into some truly intriguing and, yes, occasionally disturbing true crime cases. I'm your host, Kyra, and with me is Jen. Everything we say on our podcast is information that we have gathered from testimonies, interviews, documents, and trustful sources. Any opinion we say is our own opinion. If we get any information wrong, please feel free to let us know in the comments. We mean no disrespect to the victims or anyone affected by this case. We're going to be discussing a stretch of miles in the wilderness of northern British Columbia in Canada, focusing on the Indigenous communities and the towns that pave the way along this highway, specifically Highway 16, alternately known as the Highway of Tears, and we'll get into it. But before we start, I want to give a few trigger warnings. Today's subject really deals with a lot of intense subject matter involving First Nations people and the prejudices they deal with, as well as SA, murder, CP. Basically, if you could imagine anything horrible like genocide and the like, that's what we're going to be kind of talking about today. And if any of that is upsetting or you feel unsafe to listen to, please make sure you take care of yourself, take a bath, go relax, make sure you take care of yourself, and check out our other episodes as well. And let us begin. One thing I do want to briefly bring up before we get into today's case is a little thing called the Moose Hide campaign. They recognize that all forms of violence are unacceptable regardless of gender. They see a disproportionate number of women who are victims and the importance of engaging men and boys in addressing the same issue. We know that shame and blame isn't the answer. The Moosehead campaign helps protect these women who have been kidnapped and assaulted and murdered along this stretch of highway and fight to protect any women whose voices go unheard. We're going to include a link to their website as well as the Patreon to donate to them. 100% of the proceeds raised goes towards the campaign. Let us begin. So, the Disney princess, Pocahontas, who sailed to England to show acceptance of this new world, or really just to like use her image to promote colonialism and romanticize the indigenous culture, was kind of true. They did like kidnap a child and bring her across the sea. Disney's version of Pocahontas centers on John Smith, who she fell in love with. But in reality, when John Smith came to her town, she was only about 9 or 10 years old, while he was 27. And despite the narrative, allegedly the two were never romantically involved. Thank goodness. But that doesn't mean to say that things didn't happen to her, unfortunately. John Smith was in fact feared by many of the indigenous children in the area, as he was known to enter villages and hold various chiefs of tribes at gunpoint, demanding food and supplies. The early 1900s were an incredibly dangerous time period for tribes near, I'm going to say near the coast because I don't know how to pronounce this word, including Pocahontas's tribe. When English colonizers arrived, they began immediately targeting women and young children and began essaying them. And many of them kind of planned this kidnapping in advance because she was the chief's daughter. As time went on, and she was only about 15 or 16, the threat only increased. An English colonialist named Captain Samuel Argyle went to go and kidnap her, as he believed that if they had the chief's daughter, that the other tribes or their tribe wouldn't attack them because they were holding a child at ransom. So he threatened the chief that if he didn't relent, he would attack the whole village, likely killing everyone and essaying the women. He also told the chief that Pocahontas would only be gone temporarily. And so what he did was he gave the chief a pot made of copper, and he claims that he traded it for Pocahontas. So the value of her life and that freedom was that copper pot. Prior to leaving the village, she had to give up her baby, known as Little Coquitlam, to the women of her village. Her husband, who she'd only been married to recently, was killed by those who were kidnapping her, and she never returned home. Yeah, it's just awful. Basically, they had her on a boat and they took her back to England to just say, "Oh, like, look, there's people over there and they look kind of strange, right? Like, we should definitely bring more boats, more people." And she was kind of treated like a little oddity. And she quickly, very quickly died because her body had never been exposed to these kind of diseases. And things back then were not as hygienic as they were now. And that's only an alleged story. There's a whole bunch of stories that kind of go into it, a lot of different versions and a lot of different pieces of history. Either way, what they did was awful. And we continue to see the perpetuation of harm against Indigenous women and girls and two spirited people, especially in the pursuit of land and resources and just generally being awful to other human beings. I wanted to take you back to the time full of long hair and bell bottoms and bouncing disco music, blaring from speakers of young people growing up on the heels of the 60s as the hippie kind of wave washed over North America. Life was kind of slow among the rigid mountains and clear flowing rivers of northern British Columbia. Mile upon mile of wilderness stretched out. It kind of seemed untouched, but there were people here, Indigenous communities, and occasional towns dotted across the only paved highway in the area, Highway 16. In 1971, Ginny, she was like any typical 18-year-old. Like, she was so strong-willed and like kind of reserved a little bit. She was the second eldest of a family of 6 siblings. So, like, she grew up the whole time looking at her older sister and being like, "Yeah, you know what? I gotta be just as good as her, but I also gotta take care of my younger siblings and be a role model for them." Like, the pressure was intense, but she made it. She graduated and she was ready to take on the world. She lived in a Gitsaxen reserve of about 500 people that sat in between two rivers and parallel to the Highway 16, sorry. I want you to imagine it's a cold autumn evening. You kind of have your jacket tightened up beside you, but you know, you're 18, you don't want to seem like a nerd and wear like a big bulky jacket. So you're trying your hardest to really, you're in a hoodie and trying your hardest to imagine like you're warm, but you're still so cool. And you're hanging out with your cousin near a bridge. You're just kind of, throwing stones, shooting whatever breeze. Sorry. You're just kind of having a casual conversation, talking about your week. Oh my gosh, did you hear what Stacy said in school? Like typical kind of talk. It's a small town, so everyone knew everyone. That's exactly what Jenny was doing when she was hanging out with her cousin Alvin. He also was trying to pretend like he was super cool and that the cold didn't affect him. But eventually the cold really got to him and he said, "You know what? I'll be right back, Jenny. I just got to jet home, go grab my coat. I'll be right back. I swear I'll bring you hot chocolate." Like just to hang out here for a little bit. I'll be right back. And so he rode his bike back to his home, which was only a few minutes away, to go get his jacket and something to warm up Ginny. He told her that he wouldn't be long, but when he returned, she was gone. And to this day, she hasn't been seen in over 50 years. All the while, a trail of tears followed her. Her story and many others is what inspired Cindy Martin, a Gisaxian woman, to become passionate for advocating for missing women and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For years, she raised awareness and participated in marches, even going to Vancouver to bring up this issue, where she worked in mentoring programs and as a student advocate with the Indigenous youth in the school system. Like, she was really trying to bring awareness to this issue. She dreamed of one day opening a counseling center in order to help Indigenous families try to heal from the many consequences of colonialism, including the violence that was inflicted upon this highway of tears. Then she too went missing. 2 days before Christmas, the snow was gently settling on the trees. She was helping her 83-year-old mother and older sister try to prepare for the holidays. Much like everyone, she loved Christmas, but not for like the typical reasons. Like, I love getting presents on Christmas. Don't get me wrong, but she took it to a whole nother level. She made things from her heart. She would make handmade wooden gifts, sun catchers, and cards. Not only that, but she also brought that positivity to the community, and she worked with youth and a whole bunch of people, especially during the holiday season, to try to bring the most positive side of life to their lives. Her sister said she never heard her talk negatively. Her last conversation, the day she disappeared, her sister remembers, "I'm going to tell you a surprise. I'm going to come stay with one of our other sisters in Vancouver, and then I'm going to come see you." And at this point, she had been away for 7 years, away from her sisters. So when they said they couldn't wait to see her, They couldn't wait to see her. They were so excited. She had just finished shopping and visiting the rest of her families when she just settled down to sit and watch a movie with her mom. It was around 9 o'clock when she got a text from her ex boyfriend to get in touch. His uncle had just died and he was looking for some emotional support. Being alone in the holidays is really, really hard. So she knew what she had to do. It was only a few minutes' drive from her house to their former house that they had shared. And, what, her car and her phone were at the old house. So she borrowed her mom's car. And she said, "You know what, Mom, I'm going to call you right when I get there. Like, don't worry." She hugged her mom, and her mom remembers saying, "Yeah, I'll be okay. I got the movie playing, we got popcorn, everything's good here." It was the next morning, and Cindy still didn't call. Ring, 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 ring. Her phone kept ringing. She kept ringing her ex's phone. She kept calling anyone she knew. She called her sister, her uncle, her brother, but no one answered. No one knew where Cindy was. The car that she had left in her mother's house wasn't at her ex's house, and no one answered the door. At 9 p.m., the ex called Cindy's mom saying he hadn't seen her. But half an hour later, that ex boyfriend found the car near a suspension bridge, a single lane bridge above a deep gorge. When they searched the car, they found the car keys, her handbag, an overnight bag, a laptop, but there was no sign of Cindy. She was the baby of the family. This was only a day before Christmas. So many hearts were broken, and a trail of tears follows her to this day. The Indigenous women and children have been endangered in this area long since the arrival of the Highway 16. Miners sought to exploit Indigenous territories for gold and minerals and often posed a danger to Indigenous women and girls. SA was common. In the 1900s, drunken miners would shoot their guns, blowing tin horns and ringing the church bell down above the doors of Chisaxian homes looking for women, even though the reserves were restricted. A representative of the Canadian government on First Nations reserves, who had enforced the racist Indian Act law from the 1930s to the 1960s, had no control over the situation. This protector of the law seemed to exist only for the colonizers, not them. And if there was ever any queries, they would be locked up for questioning the way of things. In the spring of 1899, women of Haglot's, a Gisaxian community, were given alcohol and essayed by miners who took their clothes, photographed them, and carried around their underwear on sticks. This invasion of their community lasted for weeks. The Indian agent and the local priest advised the women and that their husbands should accompany their wives and daughters everywhere. A whole community had a trail of tears follow them. She was 15 years old when she was hunted down by two men that she didn't know in a car in northern British Columbia. It was 1993. She was living with her family. One early spring morning, she was riding around town with her friends when she got into a fight with her boyfriend. It was typical teenage shenanigans. Like, she just wanted to be alone, to go clear off her head, like, just separate herself from the drama of all this kind of high school drama. So she asked her friends to drop her off at the local elementary school. She just wanted to sit in the playground as she had many times before. It was dark, and she just kind of swang back and forth on the swings. All she could hear was her thoughts and the rattling of the chains as she swung back and forth. But it slowly started to get colder and colder until eventually it started to snow. It was probably a sign that she should have gotten home. Home was only 6 blocks away, a 10-minute walk, but it meant crossing Highway 16, which ran right through the middle of their town. Still, it was only 9:30. The street lamps that lined the residential areas were still well lit, and she could see the way, as it was a route she had taken many times before. But what happened on her way home will haunt her for the rest of her life. She was walking through an alleyway behind the only 7-Eleven in town when something inside her said, "Turn around." That's when she noticed a blue pickup truck slowly pull up behind her and then suddenly pass away. And then it did a literal 180 as it came straight for her. She remembers the feeling of terror that radiated through her entire body. Something just said, "Run." So she ran and she ran until she hid on the porch of a house. The car circled and pulled up in front of the house. That's when she got out of the porch and ran and just kept running. She ran to the left and she still saw two headlights coming right behind her. So she literally dove right into a puddle. It was so deep. She didn't know what kept her down there, but she held her breath. And then that's when she got up and started running again with everything she had inside of her. When she got home, her mother yelled at her for being late, but soaking wet and covered in tears, she was glad just to be alive. She remembers that night. The heaviness of that memory is palpable. As just a few months later, her 16-year-old friend, Ramona, went missing. Her body was found 10 months later in a wooded area. 27 years later, her murder still hasn't been solved. She remembers the fries that she used to share with Ramona at Tasty Freeze fast food restaurant, literally the only fast food restaurant in town, and how the two of them would sneak off to smoke behind the school on their lunch breaks. She was an innocent young girl whose life was taken far too quickly, and a trail of tears follows her. So between the late 1980s and the 1990s, more than 1,500 Indigenous children were forced to attend these things called residential schools, which we might get into on a further episode, which basically these schools were made to assimilate these children against their will into what was supposed to be the Canadian mainstream. The government recognized 139 of these schools. The RCMP enforced the law and threatened parents who refused to send their children to these schools with jail time. They would take away their children and they would lock them in jail, or they would be hit with a fine that they would never be able to pay back. It is estimated that more than 150,000 Inuit, First Nations, and Métis children attended these institutions between the 1870s and 1996, when the last school closed in 1997. Thousands of children died at these schools. But the repercussions of colonialism did not end with them. Tears streaked a man's face as he remembered his daughter's last words to him. He had just asked her to move in with him again. He wanted to take care of her, and she said yes. Her last words were, "Okay, Dad, I'll come live with you. I'll see you in 3 days." He would never see her in 3 days. He remembers his glowing, brown eyed little girl. Her last few moments on this earth were when she went to a party, but she didn't show up the next day to go pick up her daughter, and her family started to worry. The next day, they filed a missing persons report, but the police didn't take them seriously and just assumed that she was out having a good time. A typical mother who was just a drunk, a deadbeat mother who wouldn't take care of their child. So, not knowing what else to do, the family, organized their own search. They drove hundreds of miles all over Highway 16, the surrounding towns, and the reserves to look for Jessica. The local newspapers printed off missing posters with her photo, and they pasted them literally on every square inch of every town and every village. It wasn't long before they found Jessica. The authorities had to put her in a steel box. It had to be a closed casket because of the way they found her. She was deteriorated beyond recognition, but they still brought the dad in to identify the body. He remembers bringing her body back. He could smell the death, but he says it was also beautiful because so many people went to the funeral. His daughter brought so many people together in her death, but all the while, a trail of tears followed. She was a Gasaxian woman. She loved the opportunity to teach people about her culture, her language, and dancing, honestly. She knew the dangers that lurked nearby. She had heard of Indigenous girls being snatched away along the highway of tears, never to be seen again. But you never would think that you would be one of them. It was a November morning when she missed the school bus. All she wanted was a few more bites of cereal, just a few, but the school bus never waited for her. Ugh, she couldn't help but sigh with irritation. Okay, it's not the worst thing, but it's not the best thing. So she started walking from her home to the school, which she had done several times before. This wasn't her first rodeo missing the bus. It was a chilly but bright, sunny day as she snuggled into her coat, making this about 15-minute walk. As she approached an area the locals called Snake Hill. It was named this because it was a steep, rounded hill on the highway that takes about 10 minutes to climb. Like, it's quite the arduous journey, she sighed as she was about to climb, when a white pickup truck appeared from the top of the hill. It slowed down as it approached her, and the two men inside the cab began to catcall her. Ugh, God, just shut up, she said as she ignored them and kept walking. They were yelling, saying that she was being disrespectful by not acknowledging them, like she should have been grateful that they wanted to even give her a ride, let alone spend time with her, that they should teach her a lesson. The men, who she estimated was about 25 to 35, pulled over, got out, and began walking towards her. She dropped her checkered black and white backpack, filled full of school books, and ran. She ran and threw the backpack onto the road because she knew that people knew what her bag looked like and that she would have walked that way. That way, if she was murdered, there would have been some kind of evidence left behind. That's when they tackled her. She remembers the muddy, tree filled embankment as the roots pressed in her spine. She shook for air as they started ripping her clothes off, and the mud was so cold. One of them would hold her down while she was essayed. His hand was on her neck the whole time, and she remembers, this is it. This is how I'm gonna die. There were bite marks all over her arms and her stomach. As the sun was out, the two men left her, barely alive, beaten, and cold. Eventually, after she heard the truck pull away, even for hours after that, she stood up, grabbed her backpack, what clothes were left, but she didn't want to go home. Her mother was a survivor of the residential school system, and she didn't think her mom could handle knowing what happened to her. So she just went to a friend's house where she took a long shower. She wanted to wash them off of her. Then her friend found her a ride who would take her to the hospital. But once she was there, nurses just rolled their eyes. No one examined her. They called in the RCMP, and she told the officer what happened. He listened, but he didn't take any notes. He kept saying that didn't sound right. He said, you're typically hurt by someone you know. And he kept repeating that over and over and over again. That's when she just walked out of the hospital. It was so easy for them to be monsters. And so a trail of tears follows her for the rest of her life. It was a cold day in February when she awoke to blood curdling screams. Moments later, she opened up the door to her shop and shoved a young woman inside. She was naked and bleeding and barely alive. She immediately closed her store and tried her best to clean up the young woman, all the while putting pressure on her wounds, trying to clothe her, and she was crying the whole time, begging for her mother. But she was barely coherent. She thinks she was drugged. She said the young woman told her that she had been held against her will by older men in an apartment and where she had been repeatedly essayed by a group. She said she knew who the men were, but she was horrified when the police turned up and asked the young woman how much alcohol she had. She recalls people pointing and laughing. Violence is growing rapidly, and the normalization that we see through social media against women is appalling. No one does anything. She was looked at as just another drunk Indian. What if all these women who were missing and being murdered were Caucasian? That woman reflected. When will the trail of tears end? Indigenous women are 4 times more likely than non Indigenous women to be victims of violence. Did you know that Indigenous women make up 16% of all female homicide victims, 11% of missing women, and yet they only make up 4% of the population of Canada. These women are not just another statistic, they're human beings, a breathing, living human being. These women oftentimes were the head of their households, the decision makers. They were highly respected as knowledge keepers, land caretakers, and life givers. But along with colonialization came degradation and disrespect. These women are being treated like trash, and so many people are still missing to this day. And that's where we're going to end today's case. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. This one is a little bit more of a more broad case, as there's so many cases taking place on Highway 16. But yeah, let us know your thoughts. And as always, take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next episode.